Hey everyone, it's Jimmy asking you to click the like and subscribe buttons, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment saying where you're listening from. Or if you don't want to do that, just go down and comment the I'm doing my part meme. Any comment helps me out a ton in the algorithm. Anyway, with all that said, let's get down to discussing 4 Viking historical mysteries. In the late summer of 1066, a formidable fleet of over 300 longships sliced through the waters of the North Sea, their dragon-headed prows pointed towards England. At the helm of this great armada stood Harald Sigurdsson, King of Norway, a man known to history by a name he had earned through a lifetime of ruthless ambition: Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. At 50 years old, he was a living legend, a giant of a man that contemporaries claimed stood over 7 feet tall, the last of the great Viking warrior kings. This was no mere raid for plunder. This was a full-scale invasion, a kingdom-wide mobilization so serious that Hardrada had brought his own family. He intended to plant his banner on English soil and stay. He came not just with swords, but with a story, a claim to the English throne passed down through a chain of treaties and inheritances. But as his fleet neared the coast, the central question of his legacy hung in the salt-laced air. Was this the righteous quest of a legitimate heir seeking his rightful inheritance, or was it the final audacious gamble of a battle-hardened opportunist whose claim was forged in iron? Harald Hardrada's entire life was based on a relentless pursuit of power. His story begins not with an easy ascension to a throne, but in the mud of defeat. In 1030, at the tender age of 15, he fought alongside his half-brother, Saint Olaf, at the Battle of Stiklestad. This was a failed bid to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish king, Canute the Great. Wounded and on the losing side, the young Harald was forced into a 15-year exile that would serve as his brutal education in the realities of power. His path led him east, first to the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kievan Rus, where the prince quickly proved his military worth and became a captain of Yaroslav's forces. From there, his ambition took him to the glittering heart of the medieval world, Constantinople, or as the Norse called it, Miklagard, the great city. Here, Hardrada joined the Varangian Guard, the elite axe-wielding bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. He excelled, rising to become the commander of this legendary mercenary unit. For nearly a decade, he saw action across the vast frontiers of the empire, from campaigns against Saracen pirates in the Mediterranean to quelling rebellions in Bulgaria. His ferocity earned him the fearsome moniker Harald the Bulgar Burner amongst both his friends and his foes. Interestingly, his exploits are chronicled not only in the Norse sagas, but also in Byzantine records from a writer and general named Kekamenos. He served alongside him and described him as an honorable and brave leader worthy of his royal status. Throughout this service, he amassed an immense fortune, which he shrewdly sent back to the lands of Yaroslavl for safekeeping. This long, violent apprenticeship as a soldier of fortune fundamentally shaped his perspective. For Hardrada, kingship wasn't a birthright to be passively inherited, but a prize to be won through military might, strategic cunning, and sheer force of will. When he finally returned to Norway in 1046, he didn't wait for an invitation. He used his vast wealth and intimidating reputation to force his own nephew, King Magnus the Good, into a co-rulership. When Magnus died a year later under somewhat suspicious circumstances, Hardrada became the sole, undisputed king. He approached the throne of England with this same mercenary mindset. It was the ultimate campaign, and his legal claim was simply the justification for the conflict he was born to fight. On its face, Harald Hardrada's legal argument for the English crown was built upon a specific, if remote, diplomatic agreement. The case begins with his predecessor, King Magnus the Good of Norway, and Harthacnut, the Anglo-Danish king of England and Denmark, and son of Canute the Great. In the late 1030s, these two rulers were locked in a bitter dispute for control of Denmark. To avert a costly war, they reportedly forged a treaty around 1038. The core of this pact was a succession clause. Should either king die without a male heir, the survivor would inherit the other's entire domain. This agreement was put to the test in 1042 when Harthacnut collapsed and died at a wedding feast, leaving no children. True to the treaty, Magnus of Norway was acknowledged as the new king of Denmark. At that time, Magnus also declared his right to the English throne as part of Harthacnut's inheritance. However, he never acted on it. The English magnates, showing little regard for a Scandinavian pact, had already moved to restore the old Wessex dynasty by crowning Edward the Confessor king. When Magnus himself died in 1047, Harald Hardrada succeeded him as King of Norway. In Hardrada's view, he inherited not just the Norwegian crown, but all of Magnus's titles and legal claims, including the dormant one to England, derived from the treaty with Harthacnut. Thus, when Edward the Confessor died childless in 1066, Hardrada argued that the old pact was now due. The English crown, he reasoned, should have rightfully passed from Harthacnut to Magnus, and therefore now belonged to him as Magnus's heir. It was a neat logical chain, at least from a Norwegian perspective. The fatal weakness in this argument, however, was the unproven and highly convenient assumption that the treaty ever included England at all. Further, even if it did, the Anglo-Saxons had no say in this, and their cultural traditions were much different, as I'll get to in a moment. Whatever the terms of the Magnus-Harthacnut Pact, it was utterly irrelevant to the English. The 1066 succession crisis was, at its heart, a collision of three distinct legal and political cultures. Hardrada's claim was by far the most alien to the established traditions associated with the English crown. In Anglo-Saxon England, the crown was not a piece of personal property that a king could bargain away in a foreign treaty without the consent of his people. Succession was not determined by strict automatic rules of primogeniture, but was a more fluid and political process. The ultimate authority in the matter rested with the Witenagemot, an Anglo-Saxon word meaning the meeting of wise men, that I'll just refer to as the council from here on out. This great council, comprising the most powerful earls and bishops in the realm, had the duty to advise the king, and most critically, to elect his successor. While candidates were chosen from the extended royal family, the council's primary goal was to select the man best equipped to rule and defend the kingdom. Furthermore, a previous king's nomination carried immense legal and moral weight with the council. According to every English source, on January 5, 1066, the dying king Edward the Confessor named the most powerful man in the kingdom, Harald Godwinson, as his heir. The very next day, the council convened, formally elected Godwinson, and he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. By the laws and customs of England, this sequence of events, royal designation confirmed by council election, made Harald Godwinson the one and only legitimate king. From this English legal standpoint, Hardrada's claim, based on a second-hand interpretation of a foreign pact, was not a serious legal challenge. It was the pretext for an invasion. A weak claim, however, can become a potent threat when combined with opportunity and a powerful, vengeful ally. For Harald Hardrada, that ally was Tostig Godwinson, the exiled and embittered brother of the new English king. Tostig had been appointed Earl of Northumbria in 1055, but his rule over the fiercely independent Anglo-Danish North was disastrous. As a southerner, he failed to understand the region's unique customs, and his tenure was marked by heavy taxation, frequent absences, and noble and popular uprisings. In October 1065, the leading nobles of Northumbria rose in open rebellion, declared Tostig an outlaw, and demanded he be replaced by a local magnate, Morcar. King Edward ordered Harald Godwinson to march north and crush the revolt. But Harald, ever the pragmatist and likely seeing the need for a united kingdom against the looming threat of William of Normandy, chose a different path. He met with the rebels, acknowledged the justice of their cause, and persuaded the king to accept their terms. Tostig was stripped of his earldom and banished from England. Feeling utterly betrayed by the brother who had sided with his enemies, Tostig embarked on a quest for revenge. He first sought an alliance with William of Normandy, which failed. Then he attempted his own raids on the English coast, but was easily repelled. Finally, he sailed to Norway. There, he found a receptive audience in Harald Hardrada. Sources suggest the Norwegian king was initially hesitant, having just concluded a long and draining war with Denmark. But Tostig was persuasive. He offered Hardrada not only his support, but also critical intelligence. He claimed that the Anglo-Danish population of northern England would rise up to support a new Viking king. Tostig's personal vendetta was the indispensable spark that ignited Hardrada's ambition and launched the great invasion fleet. With Tostig at his side, Hardrada's theoretical claim became a terrifying reality for Harald Godwinson. In September 1066, the Norwegian army landed unopposed and marched on York, the capital of the north. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, the very men who had replaced Tostig, hastily assembled an army to block their path. At the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, the English forces were annihilated. The Norwegian veterans, hardened by decades of conflict, shattered the English shield wall. The victory was total. York surrendered, and Hardrada began taking hostages, acting every bit the conquering king. This triumph, however, was short-lived. King Harald Godwinson responded with almost superhuman speed. In a legendary feat of military logistics, he force-marched his elite army nearly 200 miles north in just 4 days. On September 25th, he caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge. The invaders, basking in their recent victory, were largely without their armor. According to the Norse sagas, before the fighting began, King Harald himself rode out and offered his brother Tostig a full pardon and the return of his lands. When Tostig asked what he would offer King Harald of Norway, the reply was chillingly prophetic. According to legend, he would offer Hardrada 7 feet of English ground for his eternal rest, quipping that he needed extra space since he was so tall. By the end of the day, both Hardrada, struck in the throat by an arrow, and Tostig lay dead. The Viking army was so utterly destroyed that of the 300 ships that had arrived, only somewhere around 25 ended up making the return voyage. In the final analysis, Harald Hardrada's claim to the English throne was legally baseless by the standards of the kingdom he sought to rule. It relied on a foreign pact that the English nobility never recognized, and ignored the established authority of the council that chose Anglo-Saxon kings. Yet, while legally weak, the claim was made politically and militarily formidable by the character of the claimant. It was, in essence, a justification for one last great Viking adventure, an attempt to resurrect Canute's great North Sea empire through force of arms. And as a quick postscript, Harald Godwinson wouldn't be dropping witty one-liners for much longer. In his failed conquest, Harald Hardrada had a decisive impact on England's fate, and due to the importance of this island to the world, massively changed the entire course of history. His invasion forced King Harald Godwinson's army into a grueling 400-mile march and 2 battles in the space of a week. The English victory at Stamford Bridge came at a terrible cost. leaving Harald's army battered, exhausted, and far from the southern coast. In the end, the last great Viking king's quest for the throne virtually ensured it would fall to another man of Viking descent, William, Duke of Normandy. Sometime around the year 1000, on a grassy terrace overlooking a bay at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, a Norseman felled a tree with an iron axe. L'Anse aux Meadows contains the remains of 8 timber and sod buildings, including dwellings, workshops, and a forge, the first known site of iron smelting in the New World. Over 800 artifacts of clear Norse origin have been unearthed, from a bronze cloak pin to women's jewelry. But this wasn't just a colony. It was a base camp, a waypoint for repairing ships, and crucially, for launching exploratory voyages further south. The discovery of butternuts, a type of walnut that doesn't grow north of modern-day New Brunswick, confirms that these Norse explorers did indeed venture deeper into the continent. This raises the question of just how much further these Viking explorers may have pushed into the Americas. Some believe these master seafarers may have pushed their ships south, past the shores of New England, beyond the Caribbean, and into the world of the Maya and the Toltecs. The idea that Vikings reached Mesoamerica is a powerful and persistent one, fueled by a collection of tantalizing but ultimately problematic clues. At the heart of this theory lies the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the most important deities in the Mesoamerican pantheon. According to post-conquest legends, Quetzalcoatl was sometimes depicted as a pale-skinned, bearded man who arrived from the sea. He taught the people arts and sciences, and promised one day to return from the east. Proponents of the Viking theory seize upon this description, suggesting it matches a lost Norse explorer who washed ashore and was deified by the local population. Some have even tried to draw a linguistic line between the Norse god Odin, also known as Woden, and a regional Maya deity known as Votan, claiming it as proof of a cultural exchange. This central myth is often supported by other highly interpretive evidence. At the great Maya city of Chichen Itza, murals within the Temple of the Warriors depict complex battle scenes. Some observers note light-skinned, blonde-haired figures among the warriors, either fighting, being taken captive, or sacrificed. The Icelandic sagas tell the tale of a Norseman who was driven far to the southwest by a storm and was last seen as a chieftain in a mysterious, warm, foreign land. Adding to this speculative evidence is a bizarre physical object, the Takaxic head. This small terracotta head, which some believe may be of Roman origin, was reportedly discovered in 1933 in a pre-Columbian grave in central Mexico. Since Vikings traveled and traded throughout the Eastern Roman world, some have suggested the head could have been a cherished souvenir. However, the chain of custody on this item is disputed, and this has been a one-of-a-kind find. When we move from the realm of interpretation to the sciences of archaeology, genetics, and historiography, the case for Vikings in Mexico becomes much weaker. The contrast with L'Anse aux Meadows is stark. The evidence in Newfoundland is physical, testable, and unambiguous. The evidence in Mexico is entirely subjective and interpretive, and in the case of the head, may simply be a fraud. Decades of intensive excavation across Mexico and Central America have unearthed millions of artifacts from the Olmec, Maya, Toltec, and Aztec civilizations. Not one of them is of confirmed Norse origin. There are no iron boat rivets, no runic inscriptions on stone, no Norse tools, weapons, or burials. The Takaxic head, the supposed hard evidence, is a textbook example of an out-of-place artifact with fatally flawed provenance. It was allegedly found in 1933, but not reported until 1960. and the original excavation was poorly documented with no photographs. There's also a claim that the head was placed there not as an actual fraud or hoax, but as a practical joke on one of the archaeologists on the dig. Modern scientific testing does suggest the head is actually ancient, but of course this doesn't necessarily prove pre-Columbian arrival given the custody issues. There's also the matter of the genetic footprint, which arguably tells a fairly definitive story. Modern genetic analysis allows scientists to trace ancient population movements with incredible precision. Norse migrations left a clear genetic signature across the North Atlantic in the DNA of modern populations in the British Isles, Iceland, and parts of Russia. Yet, extensive genetic surveys of both modern and ancient DNA from indigenous Mesoamerican populations show no trace of Norse or any other European ancestry prior to Columbus. On the other side of the Atlantic, some modern Icelanders are the descendants of a Native American woman who was brought back to Iceland. However, she was likely from Newfoundland, and definitely not from Mesoamerica. That said, if the Norse were captured and sacrificed, this may explain their lack of any genetic impact. Finally, the Quetzalcoatl myth itself, when properly examined, predates the Vikings by more than a millennium. The popular image of a white bearded god who promised to return isn't found in any authentic pre-Columbian sources. That's not to say it didn't actually exist, given the mass destruction of pre-Columbian artifacts by the Spanish, but many propose a different origin of the story. Under this theory, the narrative was a post-conquest invention, likely created and promoted by Spanish friars in the 16th century. Under this theory, the idea was spread to imply that Quetzalcoatl was actually Jesus Christ, making the arrival of the Spanish a divine prophecy fulfilled. Even if one were to ignore the complete lack of physical proof, the logistical and geopolitical realities of the 11th century make a Viking voyage to Mexico a near impossibility. The primary obstacle was the ocean itself. The entire eastern seaboard of North America is dominated by the Gulf Stream. This is a massive and powerful current that flows like a river heading northward in the ocean. A Viking ship attempting to sail south from New England would have been fighting directly against a current flowing at up to 6 miles per hour. This would have been a monumental challenge for a vessel with a single square sail and oars. This wall of water would have made a southbound journey incredibly slow and arduous, if not impossible. After a thorough review of the archaeological, genetic, historical, and logistical evidence, the verdict is clear. There's no credible scientific proof to support the theory that Vikings ever reached Mexico or Central America. While there are tantalizing morsels of highly speculative evidence, at the end of the day, at present, it's much more likely than not that no Vikings ever got to Central America. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Also, don't forget that you can toss me a clam or two through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. Close your eyes and picture a Viking. The image that springs to mind is almost certainly a towering bearded warrior, clad in furs and leather, brandishing a fearsome axe. And on his head, he's of course wearing a helmet. That popular culture would have you believe is crowned with a pair of intimidating curved horns. This warrior is an icon, a staple of everything from cartoons to sports team mascots. He's powerful, instantly recognizable, and utterly wrong. The horned helmet, the single most defining feature of the pop culture Viking, is a complete fabrication. It's a piece of 19th century stagecraft that has successfully masqueraded as history for 150 years. Our investigation begins where all historical truth must, with the physical evidence. When it comes to Viking headgear, the archaeological record is remarkably quiet, but what it does say is decisive. To date, Only one complete, verifiable combat helmet from the entire Viking Age has ever been discovered. Unearthed in 1943 from a chieftain's burial mound at Norway, this 10th century artifact is our gold standard. It was found among the cremated remains of a wealthy warrior, accompanied by a full suit of chainmail, swords, spears, and axes, the gear of a true military elite. The helmet itself is a masterpiece of practical, deadly design. It's a rounded iron cap built in the Spangenhelm style from 4 interlocking plates, designed to deflect sword blows. A distinctive guard protects the eyes and nose without obscuring vision. It's a functional piece of hardware, showing evidence of battle damage that confirms its use in actual combat. Every element has a distinct and defined purpose that offers protection to the warrior. This isn't to say horned helmets are entirely alien to Scandinavian history. They did exist, but the people who wore them lived in a world so ancient that the Vikings themselves would have considered it the stuff of legend. In 1942, 2 magnificent bronze helmets were pulled from a peat bog in Viksø, Denmark. They're elegant, decorated with the eyes and beak of a bird of prey, and feature gracefully curving horns. They are also from the Nordic Bronze Age. Recent radiocarbon dating of birch tar used in their construction places them around 1000 BC, nearly 2,000 years before a Viking longship ever left port. These were not helmets for combat. They are far too thin and fragile to have stopped a weapon. Scholars believe they were worn by chieftains or priests during religious ceremonies, possibly to channel the power of animal deities. This tradition of adding horns to ceremonial helmets is thought to have continued on into the Viking Age. However, unlike horned helmets potentially worn by figures like the Teutonic Knights, these helmets have no historical basis for use in combat. The cultural and political currents of the 19th century would transform this ahistorical helmet into a prime part of Norse heritage. The era was defined by Romantic nationalism, a movement where nations sought to build a unique identity by looking back to a heroic, often mythologized, past. For countries like Sweden and Norway, the Viking Age became their golden era, a time of strength, adventure, and pure, untamed spirit. The historical Norseman, who often doubled as a farmer and trader, was reborn and romanticized as a heroic Viking warrior. The Viking was no longer a pre-modern pirate, but something to be proud of. Artists began creating dramatic, influential images of these newly heroic Vikings. Seeking to portray them as fierce and wild, they took artistic license and began adding horns and wings to their helmets, likely inspired by ancient ceremonial artifacts. It was German composer Richard Wagner, however, who launched the myth onto the world stage. The 1876 premiere of his monumental opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen, was a cultural earthquake. For this epic retelling of Germanic and Norse myths, the costume designer was tasked with creating a new, authentically Nordic look. Ironically, in his quest for historical inspiration, the designer made the same mistake, because he looked to the painter's work. To find out what an authentic Norseman looked like, he didn't turn to scholarship, but to the artists who had depicted heroic Vikings. The designer then created costumes that included both winged helmets for the heroic Valkyries and horned helmets for the more brutish characters. Wagner himself reportedly hated the designs, challenging the historicity of them, but for reasons of time and money, they were used, and the opera was a colossal success. As it toured Europe and America, this vision became inseparable from the historical reality. Beyond the lack of archaeological evidence and the clear historical origins of the myth, there's a final, compelling argument against horned helmets: common sense. On a battlefield, they would have been a fatal liability. A helmet's primary purpose is to deflect blows. something the smooth, rounded shape of the complete Viking helmet does perfectly. Horns do the opposite. They risk catching an opponent's blade or axe, transferring the full, deadly force of the blow to the wearer's head and neck. They also provide a perfect, convenient handhold for an enemy to grab, allowing them to wrench your head and control your movement. In the crush of a shield wall or on the cramped deck of a longship, they would have snagged on everything: shields, rigging, weapons, and fellow warriors. In short, the historical consensus is clear. Horned helmets, to the extent they existed, were for ceremonial purposes only, not combat. The year 793 began with terror. According to the scribes of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the skies over the kingdom of Northumbria filled with dreadful signs. According to this source, there was everything from massive whirlwinds to sightings of multiple fire-breathing dragons in the sky. These terrifying portents were followed by a great famine, and for the anxious inhabitants, it must have felt as if the world itself was coming undone. On June 8, 793, a brutal and shocking Viking assault on the monastery on the holy island of Lindisfarne would mark the traditional birth of the Viking Age. For over a millennium, historians accepted this as the dawn of the Viking era. However, new evidence suggests the age of the Norse raider began earlier. To understand why the raid on Lindisfarne had such a profound impact, one must first understand what the island represented. Lindisfarne was the sacred heart of Northumbrian Christianity, the very place where the faith had first taken root in the region. It was a preeminent center of learning and pilgrimage, made holy by its association with Saint Cuthbert, a revered bishop and miracle worker. For the Vikings to strike here was an assault on God himself in one of his holiest sanctuaries in the British Isles. News of the atrocity spread with shocking speed, sending a tremor of fear throughout Christian Europe. The most powerful voice of this horror belonged to Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar serving at the court of the great Frankish emperor Charlemagne. In a series of anguished letters to the Northumbrian king Ethelred and Lindisfarne's bishop Higbald, Alcuin painted a visceral picture of the desecration. Yet Alcuin's reaction went beyond simple horror. He sought a theological explanation for how God could allow such a thing to happen. The answer, he concluded, lay not with the pagans, but with the sins of the Northumbrians themselves. The raid, he argued, was divine retribution. He chastised King Ethelred and his court for their luxurious habits and immoral behavior. One of the greatest offenses they had committed was trimming their beards and hair in a style that he viewed as distinctively pagan. He also pointed out that the Anglo-Saxons had been engaging in all sorts of immoralities, up to and including regicide. This framing ensured the event wasn't forgotten as just another coastal attack, but was instead amplified and recorded as an epoch-defining moment. For all its historical weight, the narrative of Lindisfarne as the absolute beginning of the Viking Age is challenged by compelling evidence of a more gradual and complex start. The most direct contradiction comes from the very same source that immortalized the 793 raid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also records an earlier, fatal encounter with Norse raiders. During the reign of King Beorhtric of Wessex, sometime around the year 789, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland in Dorset. The local king's reeve, a man named Beatahard, rode out to meet them. Crucially, the Chronicle notes that he intended to escort them to the king's town because, quote, he knew not what they were, assuming them to be traitors. For his trouble, the reeve and his men were slain. A survivor ended up reporting large-scale looting occurred after. The reeve's fatal misunderstanding is key. His assumption that the visitors were merchants implies that the sight of Scandinavian ships arriving peacefully for commerce was a known occurrence. He didn't see any threat, and actually wanted to give them an official escort to town for this trade. Archaeological discoveries have powerfully reinforced this idea. Well before 793, Scandinavia was already deeply integrated into a bustling North Sea economic network. Excavations at trading towns in Denmark reveal a sophisticated, planned marketplace in operation from as early as around 700. This evidence shows items from Britain and the Frankish Empire, likely proving that Norsemen were already accomplished seafarers. The iconic Viking longship was not a sudden invention, but the culmination of a long evolution in shipbuilding. Archaeological evidence suggests that primitive versions of the iconic longships existed by the end of the 7th century. The evidence strongly suggests that the start of the Viking Age wasn't marked by the first appearance of a longship off the European coast. Rather, the age began by a strategic and brutal shift in the behavior of the people on board. It was a change in their business model from primarily peaceful commerce to increasingly violent and opportunistic plunder. This shift from trader to raider wasn't caused by a single factor, but by a perfect storm of converging pressures and opportunities. A combination of push factors from within Scandinavia and pull factors from a vulnerable Europe created the conditions for an unprecedented wave of expansion. Within late 8th century Scandinavia, the political landscape was a fragmented patchwork of territories ruled by chieftains and petty kings. In this highly competitive society, a leader's power depended on his ability to attract and retain a band of loyal followers. As with all forms of Germanic kingship, this loyalty was secured through personal relationships formed on the basis of generosity, rather than anything resembling a modern state. This required the constant distribution of wealth in the form of silver, weapons, and luxury goods. Raiding abroad was a direct and effective way to acquire the portable treasure needed to fuel this gift-giving economy and enhance one's prestige. Social pressures also played a crucial role. The common practice of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the family land, created a class of landless younger sons. Simply put, they had enough wealth and influence to fund a ship and get some tough men together. Some scholars also point to a demographic imbalance, a surplus of young men competing for the best marriage opportunities. While these internal pressures provided the motivation, the situation in Europe provided the opportunity. To the Norsemen, the kingdoms of the British Isles and the vast Carolingian Empire were treasure chests left unlocked. Monasteries, in particular, were seen not as holy sanctuaries, but as undefended repositories of wealth. Filled with gold and silver liturgical objects, they were easy targets for pagan raiders who felt no religious prohibition against plundering them. Beyond the monasteries, the political situation in Europe was increasingly fragile. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were often in a state of internal disarray, warring amongst themselves. More significantly, the mighty Carolingian Empire, which had once presented a formidable, well-defended frontier, began to weaken after the death of Charlemagne. His successors engaged in bitter conflicts over the division of the empire, which led to the neglect of coastal defenses. Vikings, with their peerless maritime technology and warrior culture, were perfectly positioned to exploit this vulnerability. Rather than engaging in high-risk, low-reward trading ventures, they could engage in low-risk, high-reward strikes on undefended monasteries. While the raid on Lindisfarne remains a pivotal event, the modern scholarly consensus has moved beyond viewing it as the singular, definitive start of the Viking Age. The historical and archaeological records paint a much more nuanced picture of a gradual escalation. The Viking Age didn't begin on a single Tuesday in June as was once thought. It emerged from a decades-long process that saw peaceful trade evolve into opportunistic piracy, and small-scale violence grow into ever larger raids. Perhaps the very question of when the age quote unquote began is a product of our modern desire for neat historical periods. For the people living through it, there was no clear starting line. If a Norseman was chopping you to bits to get a silver chalice, you were living in the Viking Age.